Have you ever trusted someone with your expertise only to watch them weaponize it against you? Hit that subscribe button. Subscribe if you believe that people who try to destroy your career by using your own knowledge eventually discover you're always 3 steps ahead. Because what I'm about to tell you proves that sometimes the person who studies your work to frame you forgets that you wrote the playbook on criminal psychology. My name is Charlotte Pratt. I'm 38 years old, and I'm a criminologist specializing in behavioral analysis and criminal profiling. And the day I realized my most brilliant student was committing murders designed to destroy my credibility was the day I understood that academic brilliance without moral foundation creates the most dangerous criminals. But before I tell you about the psychological chess game that nearly cost me everything, let me take you back to where mentorship became manipulation and trust became the weapon used against me, because every story of intellectual warfare starts with someone believing they can outsmart the person who taught them everything they know. I'd been a professor of criminology at Westfield University for 8 years when I met Tobias Crane. It was the fall semester when I was 35, and I was teaching an advanced course on criminal behavioral patterns and predictive profiling. Tobias was a graduate student, 27 years old, brilliant in ways that made other students seem pedestrian. He had a photographic memory, an intuitive grasp of psychological theory, and the kind of analytical mind that could see patterns others missed entirely. From the first week, he dominated class discussions. While other students regurgitated textbook theories, Tobias would synthesize multiple frameworks into novel insights about criminal motivation and behavior. He'd challenge my assertions respectfully but confidently, pushing conversations into territory that made everyone think more deeply. After one particularly engaging seminar, he approached me with questions that extended well beyond the curriculum. "Professor Pratt," he said, his eyes intense with intellectual curiosity, "your work on copycat crimes is fascinating. Have you considered how modern killers might use your published research to evolve beyond detection?" "It's possible," I admitted, intrigued by the question. "Any published methodology creates opportunities for adaptation. That's why criminal psychology has to stay ahead of actual criminal behavior." "I'd be interested in exploring this further," he continued. "Perhaps as a research assistant or through an independent study. I need someone with your expertise to guide a thesis on how criminal profiling techniques can be circumvented by educated offenders." The proposal was compelling. Tobias clearly had the intellect and drive for serious academic research. I agreed to supervise his thesis, excited to work with a student who could engage with my work at such a sophisticated level. Over the next year, Tobias became my most dedicated research assistant. He helped organize my files on historical criminal cases, analyze data for papers I was writing, and developed his thesis exploring how criminals with psychological training could evade traditional profiling. His work was exceptional, demonstrating understanding of criminal psychology that rivaled professionals with decades of experience. We'd spend hours in my office discussing case studies, debating theories, and exploring the darkest aspects of human behavior. Tobias had an unusual comfort with disturbing material. While other students would show visceral reactions to crime scene photos or detailed descriptions of violence, Tobias remained clinically detached. I'd attribute this to intellectual maturity and professional distance. Looking back, I should have recognized it as something else entirely. During the second year of working together, I published a paper that would change everything. The article was titled "Predictive Patterns in Serial Offenses: How Behavioral Signatures Create Investigative Roadmaps." I detailed how certain types of criminals left psychological fingerprints through their methodology, victim selection, and staging techniques. I included case studies showing how understanding these patterns allowed investigators to predict future crimes and identify offenders. The paper gained significant attention in both academic and law enforcement circles. I was invited to consult on active investigations, asked to speak at conferences, and approached about writing a book expanding on the research. My professional reputation reached new heights. Tobias was thrilled about the paper's success, perhaps more than I was. He'd helped with research, had reviewed multiple drafts, and understood the methodology intimately. "Your work is going to revolutionize criminal investigation," he told me enthusiastically. You've essentially created a guidebook for understanding how criminals think and operate. 4 months after my paper was published, a murder occurred in a neighboring city that immediately caught law enforcement attention. A woman named Isabel Winters was found dead in her apartment, killed in a manner that precisely matched a signature pattern I'd detailed in my paper. The murder mimicked a case study I'd used to illustrate predictive behavioral analysis. The police contacted me immediately. Professor Pratt, the lead detective, said during our first phone call, "We have a situation. A homicide that appears to have been committed by someone following patterns you described in your recent publication. We need your expertise." I agreed to consult on the case. When I reviewed the crime scene photos and investigative reports, I felt ice settle in my stomach. This wasn't just similar to the case study I'd written about. It was identical. The victim profile, the methodology, the staging, everything matched what I described as a predictive pattern for a specific type of offender. Someone had used my paper as a blueprint for murder. The realization was horrifying. My research, intended to help catch criminals, had apparently taught someone how to kill in ways that would create specific investigative responses. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked closely with the police task force analyzing evidence and developing a profile of the offender. Based on the precision of replication, I concluded we were looking for someone with extensive knowledge of criminal psychology, likely someone in law enforcement or academia. Someone who'd studied my work carefully and understood exactly what patterns would be recognizable. The task force followed several leads that went nowhere. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something obvious. Then, 5 weeks after the first murder, a second body was discovered. Another woman, different city, killed using methodology from a different case study in my paper. Same level of precision. Same deliberate replication of patterns I'd identified. This time the police were more direct. Professor Pratt, the detective, said bluntly, "We need to consider the possibility that someone is specifically targeting victims based on your research, either to discredit your work or to implicate you in these crimes." The suggestion that I might be a suspect or a target was terrifying. I'd built my career on understanding criminals, never imagining I might become connected to actual crimes. The investigation intensified. Police looked at everyone with access to my research. Students in my classes, colleagues in my department, people who'd attended conferences where I'd presented. The list was extensive, and the scrutiny was uncomfortable. Meanwhile, media attention exploded. Local news covered the Copycat murders extensively, with journalists making the connection to my published paper. Some articles suggested my research had been irresponsible, that publishing detailed criminal methodologies created a high guide for killers. My professional reputation, which had been elevated by that paper, was now being destroyed by its unintended consequences. During this period, Tobias was incredibly supportive. He helped me manage the media inquiries, organized my research materials for police review, and defended my work publicly when other students or faculty members questioned whether I should have published something so detailed. "You didn't do anything wrong," he'd tell me repeatedly. "Your research is brilliant. It's not your fault some psychopath is using it to kill people. You can't blame the messenger for how the message is received." I was grateful for his support during a time when many colleagues were distancing themselves from me. Then the third murder happened. This one was different in a crucial way. The victim was found with a note that referenced my work directly, quoting passages from my paper and including taunts about how easily behavioral patterns could be manipulated. The note was clearly designed to implicate me, to suggest I had detailed knowledge of crimes that hadn't been made public. Police brought me in for formal questioning. For 6 hours, I sat in an interrogation room answering questions about my whereabouts during each murder, my access to the victim's information, my motivation for possibly committing crimes that would validate my own research. It was surreal and terrifying. I'd spent years studying criminal interrogations. Now I was experiencing one firsthand, understanding viscerally how innocent people could be made to feel guilty simply through the pressure of sustained questioning. My attorney, a sharp woman named Vivian, finally ended the interrogation. "My client has cooperated fully," she told the detectives. You have no physical evidence connecting her to these crimes. Questioning her further without charging her constitutes harassment. The police let me go but made it clear I remained a person of interest. The publicity was devastating. Local media reported that criminology professor Charlotte Pratt had been questioned in connection with the Copycat murders. My university placed me on administrative leave pending resolution of the investigation. Students circulated petitions demanding I be fired. My life's work was collapsing because someone was using my research to commit murders and frame me for involvement. During this nightmare, Tobias remained my staunchest defender. He gave interviews saying I was being scapegoated, that the real killer was clearly someone trying to destroy my reputation. He organized a group of graduate students to publicly support me. His loyalty was one of the few bright spots in an increasingly dark situation. Then I made the connection that changed everything. I was reviewing my research files late one night, trying to identify anyone who might have detailed knowledge of my methodology, when I noticed something strange. Several of my case study files had been accessed and copied more extensively than necessary for legitimate research purposes. The digital timestamps showed the access had occurred over the past year, always late at night when few people were in the building. The user credentials were mine, but I hadn't made most of these accesses. Someone had been using my login to review materials without my knowledge. I checked the physical access logs for my office during corresponding time periods. They showed Tobias had been in the building during many of those late-night sessions, supposedly working on his thesis research. I'd given him a key to my office and my computer password so he could access research materials when I wasn't available. I trusted him completely. Now I realized that trust might have been a catastrophic mistake. I started reviewing Tobias's background more carefully. His academic records were stellar, but there were gaps in his personal history. He'd taken 2 years off between undergraduate and graduate school, years he'd vaguely described as traveling and working odd jobs. I hired a private investigator to look deeper. What she found was chilling. During those gap years, Tobias had been committed to a psychiatric facility after a violent incident where he'd attacked a former girlfriend. The commitment had been sealed as part of a plea agreement, which explained why it hadn't appeared in standard background checks. The diagnosis was antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic features, exactly the psychological profile common among intelligent, organized serial offenders. I'd been working closely for 2 years with someone who had the psychological makeup of the criminals I studied. Someone who'd learned my methodologies intimately. Someone with a motive to destroy my credibility because of some perceived slight or simply because he enjoyed the intellectual game. I needed proof before I could go to the police with accusations. Tobias was brilliant and careful. He'd committed murders using my published work as a template, making it look like I was either the killer or responsible for inspiring the crimes. Any accusation I made would look like desperate deflection from a suspect trying to blame her student. I realized I needed to think like Tobias thought, to anticipate his next move and gather evidence that would prove his guilt definitively. I started by analyzing the pattern of murders against my published case studies. He'd replicated 3 so far, but my paper had detailed 5 distinct behavioral patterns. If he was working through them systematically, the next murder would follow a specific profile involving a male victim killed in a public space with staging designed to send a message. I also noticed something subtle in the previous crime scenes. While the murders replicated my case studies precisely, there were tiny deviations, details that weren't exactly wrong but were slightly different from what I'd published. These deviations matched corrections Tobias had suggested during his research assistance, changes I'd rejected because they didn't align with the actual historical cases. He was using his version of my methodology, not my actual published version. This would be crucial in proving he was the killer. I developed a plan. I would publish an addendum to my original paper, supposedly correcting errors based on new research. The addendum would include subtle but deliberate mistakes, false patterns that would misdirect anyone trying to replicate the methodology. If Tobias committed another murder following my false patterns, it would prove he was using my research as a blueprint. The addendum was published in an online criminology journal with rush peer review that I'd arranged through academic connections. The false patterns I'd included were convincing enough that readers wouldn't immediately recognize them as incorrect, but they were specific enough that any crime replicating them would clearly be based on my fabricated research. Now I waited to see if Tobias would take the bait. I continued acting normally around him, discussing my distress about the murders and the investigation, giving no indication that I suspected him. He remained supportive and helpful, still playing the role of loyal student defending his mentor. 2 weeks after publishing the addendum, police discovered a fourth victim. Male, killed in a public parking structure, staged in a manner designed to send a message. Everything matched the fourth case study from my original paper. But more importantly, the staging included 3 specific elements from my false addendum, elements that I deliberately included as markers. Elements that proved the killer was using my most recent publication, not just the original paper. I immediately contacted the lead detective and explained what I'd done. "I think I know who the killer is," I said, laying out my evidence about Tobias. The access logs, his psychiatric history, the deviations in previous crime scenes, and now the replication of false patterns from my addendum. The detective was skeptical but interested. "Why would your student want to destroy you? What's his motive?" I've been thinking about this question constantly. Several possibilities existed. Tobias might harbor resentment that I was getting recognition for work he'd contributed to. He might enjoy the intellectual challenge of committing perfect crimes and framing his professor. Or most disturbingly, he might simply be a psychopath who'd attached himself to me as a source of knowledge and was now demonstrating his superiority by using my own research against me. The police agreed to investigate Tobias more closely. They obtained warrants to search his apartment and review his electronic devices. What they found was a digital archive of my complete research files, detailed notes about my schedule and habits, and drafts of future crime scene staging that matched the remaining unpublished case studies from my paper. They also found journals where Tobias had written extensively about me, describing me as both brilliant and blind, someone who understood criminal psychology academically but couldn't recognize a psychopath working directly alongside her. The journals revealed his contempt for me and his enjoyment of the elaborate game he'd been playing. Tobias was arrested at the university library where he'd been studying for a doctoral qualifying exam. The arrest was surreal. This brilliant young man who'd seemed devoted to academic excellence was led away in handcuffs while students and faculty watched in shock. During interrogation, Tobias initially claimed innocence. But when confronted with the physical evidence from his apartment and the psychological evidence of the false patterns, he smiled. That smile told me everything. He wasn't devastated by being caught. He was pleased that someone had finally appreciated the complexity of what he'd created. "You figured it out," he said to me during a meeting arranged by the police where I was allowed to observe from behind one-way glass. "I knew you would eventually. That was part of the design. I wanted you to understand that I'd learned from the master and surpassed her." The confession that followed was chilling in its detail and complete lack of remorse. Tobias explained that he'd targeted me specifically because my work represented the pinnacle of criminal psychology. By using my research to commit perfect crimes, he was proving that academic understanding wasn't enough to catch someone truly intelligent. His plan had been to complete all 5 murders replicating my case studies, destroying my reputation in the process, and then reveal himself as my student. He wanted the world to know that Charlotte Pratt, the famous criminologist, had trained the very killer who'd outsmarted everyone. "You were supposed to be discredited," he said matter-of-factly. "Your work was supposed to be seen as dangerous and irresponsible. I was going to write a book about how I learned from you and became the perfect criminal you could never catch." The ego and delusion were staggering. Tobias genuinely believed he'd created something worthy of admiration, that his murders were an intellectual achievement rather than horrific crimes that had destroyed innocent lives. The trial took place 8 months later. Tobias represented himself, using the proceedings as a platform to lecture about criminal psychology and behavioral analysis. He tried to position himself as a student who'd surpassed his teacher, who'd proven that academic criminology was insufficient for understanding truly exceptional criminals. I testified for 3 days, explaining the methodology Tobias had stolen, the false patterns I'd published to trap him, and the psychological profile that had ultimately identified him as the killer. The prosecution used my testimony and research to build a case showing premeditation, sophistication, and complete absence of remorse. The defense, such as it was with Tobias representing himself, argued that he'd been driven to these acts by obsession with my work, that I'd essentially created the monster through my detailed publication of criminal methodologies. The jury deliberated for 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Tobias showed no emotion when the verdicts were read. He was sentenced to life without possibility of parole, a sentence he accepted with the same disturbing calm he'd displayed throughout the trial. After the trial, I had to rebuild my professional reputation and process the trauma of having been targeted by someone I'd mentored. The university reinstated me, but the damage to my credibility took years to repair. Some colleagues never fully trusted me again, seeing me as someone whose research had contributed to real deaths, even if unintentionally. I published a follow-up paper about the ethical responsibilities of criminology research, about the need to balance detailed academic work with awareness that some knowledge could be weaponized. The paper sparked important conversations in the field about publication standards and the potential for research to create unintended consequences. I also started working with law enforcement more directly, using the experience with Tobias to develop training programs about how educated offenders think and operate. My unique perspective, having been targeted by someone who'd studied my work, gave me insights that pure academic research couldn't provide. 3 years after Tobias's conviction, I received a letter from him. It came from the maximum security prison where he was serving his life sentence. The letter was 12 pages of dense text explaining his thought process, his planning, and his reflections on what had happened. Professor Pratt, the letter began, "I'm writing not to apologize, because I'm not sorry for what I did, but to acknowledge that you won our game. When I say won, I mean you recognized the pattern I was creating and set a trap I couldn't resist. That takes a level of strategic thinking I'd underestimated in you. I thought academic criminologists were theorists who couldn't apply their knowledge in real time against an active threat. You proved me wrong." The letter continued in this vein, treating the entire situation like a chess match rather than a series of murders that had destroyed families. He detailed mistakes he'd made, alternative strategies he could have employed, and ways he might have evaded detection if he'd been more careful about the deviations from my published work. It was clinical, intellectual, and completely devoid of moral understanding. The final paragraphs addressed me directly. "You're probably wondering why I targeted you specifically rather than just committing crimes using your methodology anonymously," he wrote. "The truth is that destroying you was more important than the murders themselves. You represented everything I wanted to be but couldn't achieve through legitimate means. You had respect, recognition, authority in the field. I had intelligence but no credentials yet, no platform. By using your work to commit crimes and frame you for involvement, I thought I'd transfer your reputation to myself. I'd become the one people talked about, the criminal who outsmarted Charlotte Pratt. Instead, you outsmarted me. That's why I'm not sorry for what I did, but I am disappointed in how it ended. I expected more from our final confrontation." I destroyed the letter after reading it once. Tobias wanted continued engagement, wanted to maintain some connection through intellectual discussion of his crimes. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. He'd taken enough from me already. 5 years after the trial, I was approached about writing a book detailing the entire experience. Publishers were fascinated by the story of a criminologist targeted by her own student using her own research. They wanted me to provide psychological analysis of Tobias, to explore how someone so intelligent could lack all moral framework. I initially declined. The experience was still too painful, too personal. But eventually I realized that telling the story could serve an important purpose. It could educate people about how psychopaths operate, how they manipulate trust and expertise, how even trained professionals can miss warning signs when they trust someone. I wrote the book over 18 months. It was titled The Student, When Criminological Knowledge Becomes a Weapon. The book detailed everything from my first meeting with Tobias through the trial and aftermath. I included analysis of his psychological profile, the specific ways he'd used my research, and the methodology I'd employed to identify and trap him. The book became a bestseller, used as a textbook in criminology programs and read widely by people interested in true crime and criminal psychology. What surprised me most was the response from other academics who'd had similar experiences being targeted or manipulated by students or colleagues with hidden agendas. Dozens of professors reached out sharing stories about students who'd crossed boundaries, who'd become obsessed, or who'd used academic access for harmful purposes. The book sparked conversations about better screening processes, about maintaining professional boundaries, and about recognizing warning signs of antisocial behavior even in high-functioning individuals. 7 years after Tobias's conviction, I was invited to present at an international criminology conference about my research and the case. The presentation room was packed with colleagues, students, and law enforcement professionals. I spoke for 90 minutes about the technical aspects of behavioral profiling, the ethics of publishing detailed criminal research, and the personal experience of being targeted by someone who'd weaponized my own knowledge. During the question session, a young graduate student raised her hand. "Professor Pratt," she asked nervously, "how do you continue trusting students and doing research after what happened? Don't you worry every new student could be another Tobias?" "It's a fair question," I replied. "The truth is that I do maintain more careful boundaries now. I don't give students unsupervised access to sensitive research. I'm more attentive to warning signs of obsessive behavior or inappropriate attachment. But I also refuse to let one psychopath destroy my ability to mentor genuine students who deserve guidance and support." Tobias was an aberration, someone whose psychological pathology was hidden beneath intellectual brilliance. Most students are decent people who want to learn and contribute positively to the field. If I let fear prevent me from teaching and mentoring, Tobias wins. He gets to reshape my life and career through actions he committed. I won't give him that power. The response was powerful. People stood and applauded, understanding that resilience meant continuing to do meaningful work despite trauma and risk. After the presentation, several people approached me sharing their own stories of betrayal and how they'd rebuilt trust afterward. That evening, I received an email notification that Tobias had sent me another letter. I'd instructed the prison to hold his correspondence rather than forwarding it directly. This letter, the prison liaison told me, was different. "He's requesting that you visit him. He says he has information about other crimes that only he can provide, and he'll only share it with you." I knew immediately what this was. Tobias wasn't trying to help law enforcement. He was trying to re-establish contact, to draw me back into engagement with him. The information, real or fabricated, was just bait. He wanted to see if he could still manipulate me, if he could get me to visit and give him the attention and intellectual stimulation he'd been denied in prison. I declined the request. Whatever information he claimed to have, if it was real, could be obtained through other means. I wouldn't play his game or feed his narcissistic need for continued relevance in my life. Instead, I wrote a brief response through official channels. "Tobias," I wrote, "you spent years studying my work and trying to destroy my reputation through your crimes. What you fail to understand is that real strength in criminology comes not from intellectual brilliance alone but from the moral foundation that guides how knowledge is applied. You had the intelligence but lacked the character. That's why you'll spend your life in prison while I continue building meaningful contributions to a field you thought you could dominate. I won our game not because I was smarter, though ultimately I was, but because I understood something you never could. Criminal behavior, no matter how sophisticated, creates patterns. And patterns, no matter how carefully constructed, can be decoded by someone willing to look carefully enough. You taught me that lesson through your betrayal. I taught you that lesson through your capture. We're done now. I won't visit, won't read future letters, won't engage in whatever intellectual exercises you think will keep you connected to the life you destroyed. You're alone with the consequences of your choices. I suggest you make peace with that." The letter was delivered through the prison system. I never received a response. 9 years after Tobias's conviction, my career had fully recovered and then some. I'd been promoted to department chair, published 3 more books, and developed nationally recognized training programs for law enforcement on psychological profiling. My reputation was built not just on academic research but on lived experience of surviving a sophisticated attempt to destroy my credibility. Students in my program learned about the Tobias case as part of their curriculum, studying how someone with antisocial personality disorder could manipulate academic environments and weaponize knowledge. The case became a teaching tool, showing how even trained professionals could be deceived by someone sufficiently intelligent and motivated. I also started a support network for academics and professionals who'd been targeted by students, colleagues, or research subjects. The network provided resources for recognizing warning signs, maintaining appropriate boundaries, and recovering from professional betrayal. My experience, while unique in its specific details, represented a broader pattern of people in positions of knowledge being exploited by those they trusted. Last year, I was contacted by a television production company about adapting my book into a limited series. They wanted to tell the story of how a criminologist became the target of her own student, using my research against me. I agreed to participate as a consultant, ensuring the portrayal was accurate and that the series emphasized the human cost of Tobias's crimes rather than glamorizing his intelligence. The series premiered 3 months ago to strong reviews and significant viewership. People were fascinated by the psychological chess game, by how someone could be simultaneously brilliant and monstrous, by how the mentor-student relationship could be perverted into something deadly. After one episode aired showing Tobias's arrest, I received a call from the prison warden. He wanted to inform me that Tobias had watched the episode and had requested permission to provide commentary for a behind-the-scenes feature. The producers wanted my permission to include his perspective. I declined without hesitation. Tobias has had his say through his crimes, his trial, and his letters, I told the warden. He doesn't get a platform to rewrite history or present himself as anything other than what he is, a killer who destroys lives for ego and intellectual gratification. The series can tell the story without giving him additional attention or relevance. Today, at 38 years old, I continue teaching, researching, and working with law enforcement to understand and prevent violent crime. The experience with Tobias fundamentally changed how I approach my work, making me more cautious but also more determined to contribute meaningfully to criminal justice. I've trained hundreds of investigators, mentored dozens of students who've gone on to successful careers in criminology and law enforcement, and published research that's helped solve actual cases. Tobias tried to destroy my career by using my knowledge against me. Instead, he validated the importance of that knowledge and demonstrated why understanding criminal psychology matters. His attempt to prove I couldn't recognize a psychopath studying under me failed because, ultimately, I did recognize it. I decoded his pattern, set a trap, and caught him using the very methodology he'd tried to use against me. If this story showed you that people who try to destroy you with your own expertise eventually learn you're always several moves ahead, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories about psychological warfare, intellectual revenge, and using knowledge as both shield and weapon. Drop a comment about whether you think criminologists should publish detailed research knowing it could be misused. Because sometimes the best defense against someone weaponizing your knowledge is understanding that you'll always know your own work better than anyone trying to exploit it. And sometimes justice means not just catching the criminal but proving that the teacher will always outthink the student who mistakes intelligence for wisdom.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoy watching Karma, Payback, come full circle every week, we dive into tales of betrayal and poetic justice. Don't miss the next one. Tap the subscribe button and join the Revenge Squad.